So tonight, we're going to do a little bit more background information, meaning content about the Jesus Seminar itself. And then we'll do some voting. And then we'll look at some of the red and pink sayings, basically. I was going to try to do sayings and deeds, and I realized that was just way too much to cover tonight. And I don't know that we'll necessarily do deeds separately. I was thinking I'd move on to just talking about some of the more interesting historical Jesus depictions, but after Christmas, but we'll see. So that's what we're doing tonight. I imagine you've heard something like this before or seen this quote before. The Bible is true and some of it happened.
Yes.
When we're talking about the historical Jesus, this is one of the questions, right? One of the issues for people in approaching this conversation or this topic. There's a lot on the line here, right? Some of the questions from you all in the first 2 weeks, some of the questions or comments or observations were, indicating a curiosity or wondering how other scholars have perceived the effort of the Jesus Seminar, wondering what this process was like for some of those scholars, that kind of thing. And I was looking, it's kind of hard to find specifically people reacting to the Jesus Seminar, but I did find a really interesting piece but in Christianity Today, which is a nice, it's a good place for an evangelical response to this. So we'll look at some of their ideas. But this, being comfortable with this proposition, this comment, is really maybe the crux of things. When we talk about the person behind the stories, what this whole endeavor does then is it shifts the way you engage the texts. It shifts your perspective of what the Bible is in general, but specifically what the Gospels are. And so being able to be comfortable with, for instance, this line is a building block really of this endeavor, and is something that more conservative or even most evangelicals really are not comfortable with. And there are certainly historical and movement associated belief systems for why that is the case. It's not always the case, but anyway. So in my studies, in my reading around the last couple of weeks, I came across this piece where Marcus was describing what this process was like from the inside in response to someone who was assessing it from the outside. And he gave a very, I assume, a kind response to some assessments, which is it's admirable to not be petty when people misunderstand, I think, what you're doing. And when they put it in, they publish it, right? But what I thought was useful for us to talk about are the two primary reasons. I imagine there are many more, but the two that he discussed in this particular article in the Quaker Religious Thought, I don't know if it's a periodical or a journal, and so for him and many other scholars, the issue is for Marcus was, I suppose, but Marcus and other scholars who are, within the church, they're not simply addressing scripture as a scholar, period, but also as faithful Christians, right? So from his perspective, the issue is that Jesus and Christianity, right, had become unpersuasive to millions of people. And the Jesus that he's referring to, I'm just going to quote him from this article here. The Jesus that has become so unpersuasive, he's describing in this way. In shorthand, we might call this the literalistic doctrinal image of Jesus. Its central features are well known. Jesus was the only Son of God, and he knew that and taught that about himself. Conceived by the Holy Spirit, he was born of the Virgin Mary, and as the Son of God, he could do spectacular deeds like nobody else had ever been able to do. He saw his own death as salvific, as having saving, atoning significance. Indeed, his death as a sacrifice for sin was the primary purpose of his life. Easter involved the greatest miracle of all, his physical bodily resurrection from the dead. Finally, his message was primarily about himself, his role in salvation, and the importance of believing in him. So usually this image of Jesus is associated with affirming the unique and exclusive truth of Christianity, which is that Jesus is the only way of salvation. The image of the Christian life that goes with this is the one centered in believing. That's my favorite thing to talk about with students. Really? Because believing is kind of cheap sometimes. Doing is the tough part, right? Christians are people who believe all of these things to be true in a literal and factual sense. And so, of course, for him, that's not the end of the story, right? So the motivation there then was, well, what do we say to people in this century who are like to be a part of this community, who want to be a part of the church and followers of Christ, right? So in a sense, what they found obviously was that many people's response was, this gives me a way to stay in the church. What this research has done, what you all are talking about, has actually made it legit for me. I feel this I can identify with. And so the second piece of this, so that as they're looking at the Gospels, right, to be able to see and say to someone that the Gospels, there's an element of history, but it's mixed with metaphor. And this is what makes it, we can look at it a little bit more complexly. And of course, to be able to say that Jesus is not the Christ. What was so interesting to me is, as I read through the Christianity Today article, is just point by point by point of the whole purpose of the Jesus seminar was simply rejected within this article, as you might expect. And this in particular, there was a very strong mockery of this claim, the distinction between the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. And some of the parts of that article just made me really sad because, sure, there was a time in my life when I would have mocked that distinction, but, that's the whole point of education and expanding our minds. And it's okay to expand your minds, and our faith can handle it and perhaps be enriched by it. Anyway, so then the second main reason that spurred him and others on, then you could say, is this whole bit of distinguishing between the pre-Easter and the post-Easter Jesus. And it's interesting because when you think about it, if Jesus really was fully God, embodied in a human, and all he did was turn a few vats of water into wine, or walk on water, like that's all he did, like it's actually kind of not terribly impressive. Which maybe I've heard that and thought about it that way before, but I don't spend a whole lot of time focusing on this. And it gave me a good chuckle this week. It's like, yeah, it's true, right? If Jesus really was divine fully, right, then those miracles are actually a little bit lackluster. If we can stop and look at the person behind them all, right, and distinguishing between the pre-Easter, the guy who lived and the things he was up to, then we can actually, that allows us to have to engage with and to be actually, moved by how remarkable this guy actually was, right?
I remember Marcus giving a talk and talked about a few other miracle makers in the time.
Yes, exactly.
There was this guy that cured people and this guy that did this.
Exactly. Yeah, and I'm not sure that we'll have time to tonight, but there is a raising someone from the dead story that is a lovely parallel, and is actually much more interesting, I think, than the raising of Lazarus, because we get so much more context and so much more of the life situations that are being addressed by this raising. Anyway. So to see that Apollonius of Tyana raises someone from the dead as well as Jesus doing that, it does shift the way you look at this a little bit, right? This was the image in the Christianity Today article, so I thought I would share it because I thought, on one hand, I know that this is meant to, in a sense, be making fun of the Jesus of our, but it's also really, in a way, interestingly accurate. And I do just because I can't help it, I do feel like this looks like N.T. Wright. I don't know if any of you all know who these gentlemen are besides Marcus and Dom, but anyway, I found this fun, the pink out, not white out, but pink out. This dude down here underneath cutting from behind and erasing the halo of the Christ, right? Because we're talking about the Jesus of history, not the Christ of faith. Anyway, yeah. Yes and no, right? I mean, this isn't really what's going on, but this is how people get defensive. People react, and I get that too. But we could have a conversation about how white this Jesus is as compared to maybe Middle Eastern. Anyway, there's one other image I wanted to share with you, and then we will move into the sayings themselves. Let's take a minute to adjust. I've had plenty of time to adjust to this way to looking at this image. So this is a vertical timeline, not horizontal. So we're starting here at 30 and moving through the years this way, right? So these diagonal lines are aphorisms and parables, essentially the sayings, the stuff that we're talking about tonight. Excuse me. And so again, we're, the top is earlier and down here is later. So the earliest layer in terms of gospel content then would be, according to the Jesus Seminar folks, and I think that they are not alone. I think that it's a fairly widely accepted suggestion or claim that the Thomas gospel, sayings gospel, is pretty early, and perhaps as early as Q, right? Which they are suggesting come before Mark, right? So this is a little bit later, right? These horizontal lines then represent stories about Jesus. So, right, the deeds, the things claimed about him, and then the primitive Christian gospel. I'm a little bit, anyway, I don't want to spend too much time with the details here, but it is a fairly well established, a fairly well embraced perspective on things. Something about this was helpful for me to look at and to kind of put it together, that the visual of many of these sayings, aphorisms, or just one-liners or short parables that could have floated around on their own, right? Came first before pulling them together and, kind of telling a story like we get with the canonical gospels, right? Mark, and then of course Q is what Matthew and Luke share that is not in Mark, and so forth. I found this just a helpful little framework. Any comments or questions about this?
I appreciate the way that you're setting this up. And since I was the one that asked the question about how have scholars received it, yeah. I was disappointed the same way that you mentioned about the black and white nature of the discussion instead of a fair value, looking at as a journey of knowledge, right? Mm-hmm. So there was one thing that came up for me on the positioning, because I started to read more about this, right? And so the Thomas, one of the things that was brought up that I admit I don't fully grasp, but is that there's an influence of Gnosticism. Is that how you say it?
That is how you say it, yes.
On Thomas. And so I had always thought that Gnosticism was something that came later. And so I was wondering if you had run across this where some people are trying to pull Thomas into a later
That's right.
category.
That's absolutely right, Jason. Jason, right? I'm not looking at your picture right now. Yeah, that sums it up nicely. the idea, or what we call Gnostic ideas. Scholars are actually debating whether we should even be using the category of Gnosticism, which is really kind of interesting given how much scholarship that would entail, needs to be revised, but I'm all for updating, right? Whether or not that label is even useful. But yes, the idea of the focus on knowledge or having the right idea or belief, we do kind of associate with a Gnostic framework. And that is what we do see a bit. You don't see apocalyptic elements in Thomas. So the way that piece functions actually is that either, if you're going to say that Thomas is early, then that means that it's closer to the real guy. And that means the real guy wasn't very apocalyptic, and that he really was kind of floating these thoughts and ideas around more than he was rooted in that eschatological, apocalyptic grouping of people who are seeing the way the Roman Empire is treating them and the things that are happening, and are making sense of their place in the world through an apocalyptic worldview. God is going to come in and fix this problem soon because we cannot sustain this much longer, that whole bit. That belief, there is a belief that Jesus was an apocalyptic kind of a guy. And so Thomas then throws a wrench in that, right? Which way are you going to handle Thomas then, if that's the case, that he was apocalyptic? Because then Thomas isn't early. So it really, it's an interesting thing. And I'm fond of saying that Thomas is early, partly because it is much more raw. The sayings in Thomas are shorter than their parallels in the Synoptic Gospels, for instance. They're a bit more raw. They're a bit more rough. And so to me, it makes a little bit more sense as well. If we're going to draw any conclusion, which is really all we can do, right, based on what we can see, then to me, that says that Thomas is earlier. It isn't as refined. Does that?
Yeah, and there's another interesting data point that's not really good for, it's kind of more of a rabbit hole. But when I started to look at how scholars arrange the order of the New Testament, James floats to the top as the earliest. And I went back and I read James a few times, and it's not apocalyptic. It's directional towards a community, but the language matches an earlier pre-apocalyptic view, which I thought was interesting because James is considered one of the part of the canon. My big words I can't use.
That's all right. Yeah. Yes, I don't know much about James. Some of those Catholic writings I just don't spend as much time with, and so I can't really speak much to it. But I can't really say anything besides yes to what you've just said. Yeah. It would make sense in light of what is said about the early community after Jesus's execution. The communal needs and issues that came up that are discussed in the Book of Acts. But I personally. I personally also have a hard time treating Acts too much like history because there's so much propaganda and there's so many other dynamics involved in that particular book. But that's an interesting issue to be playing with, right?
And just a quick comment, I did find the evangelical response, which is this book. So I've been reading it to try to get a lens for how to place what the Jesus seminar is, against their response. And that's interesting to me. That's kind of how I've been spending my free time.
I commend you. I do. I as a former fundamentalist evangelical, that is right. That is who I used to be. Yeah, it's so central, right? This guy, Jesus, is pretty important, and messing with people's Jesus is delicate stuff. And I say, I do mean that with respect, right? Who we think Jesus is really does matter, right, to people. Maybe that's a good note to move on from this on, because, and what I was thinking would be one of the best ways perhaps to engage these sayings as a class, then obviously if you have questions or things you want to talk about, please raise your questions. But what I'm perhaps more interested in is, what does it do? How does, just setting whatever your own beliefs are, aside for a moment or whatever, what kind of a person are they suggesting this guy Jesus was, right? If we're going to just, for the evening, right, take them at their word, that the things that we're about to look at essentially primarily frame what they decided is most likely something Jesus said, or Jesus said something pretty much like this, right? Who is that? Who would your profile of Jesus be according to what you're seeing? Does that make sense? What I think, what I'm getting at? Yeah, more or less. Yeah. So I thought we'd start with the passages in Thomas. And there are a handful that are in Thomas that I just have listed from Mark, because I think I like Mark's version better or something. I don't know. But Jesus said, I have cast fire upon the world, and look, I'm guarding it until it blazes. That's in pink because it doesn't, Luke has a version that's similar, but it's a little bit nicer. It's a little bit softer. And anyway, it's pink. It is in several of the Gospels. That isn't what makes it pink. They did decide that it's likely he said something like this. Because there are several versions, that's why they're like, we're not quite sure which one is more original. This one seems to be, because it's rougher, it's shorter, it's a little bit harsher in terms of the message than the nicer one that we get in Luke and I think Matthew. So what we end up seeing then, and even as I pointed out last week when I described the kind of the characteristics of the scholars' version of the five Gospels, like their translation, right? It's a bit more rough. It's a bit more colloquial. It's a bit more street languagey, which I think that's honest, and so something like this makes me pause. And I think of my former self. I think of the evangelical self, or or even people that I know, that Jesus is a holy man. Jesus is a pious man. He didn't come to say these kinds of harsh, judgmental things, right? It doesn't sit well. But one of the red sayings, there are only a handful of outright reds, is this issue, this idea about the mustard seed. It's like the disciples asked Jesus, tell us what heaven's imperial rule is like. And he said, it's like a mustard seed. It's the smallest of all seeds. But when it falls on prepared soil, it produces a large plant and becomes a shelter for birds of the sky. Now, I actually found their commentary, they have produced really helpful and interesting, if you do like to kind of get down into the weeds a little bit and sort through not just the thinking that the scholars brought to their considerations, but also just they're comparing. They have a really helpful analysis of this version compared to the other versions that are similar, etc. So I thought I would share part of what they had to say about this one, because I think it's interesting, and I think it also helps shed light on the Jesus that they are envisioning. And that's ultimately what all of this is, right? They have a Jesus in mind that they're, and I don't say that out of any kind of disrespect at all. We all do. We all have a particular person in mind. I happen to, respect their efforts here. So the mustard seed is proverbial in its smallness. The mustard plant is actually an annual shrub or weed, not perennial. Yet in Matthew and Luke, it becomes a tree, while in Mark, it becomes the biggest of all garden plants. So they have different ways of what it starts out as and what it becomes, right? Only in Thomas does it remain a large plant. The mustard seed is an unlikely figure of speech for God's domain in Jesus's original parable. His listeners would probably have expected God's domain to be compared to something great, not something small and insignificant. As the tradition was passed on, it fell under the influence of two figures. That of the mighty cedar of Lebanon as a metaphor for a towering empire, drawing from Ezekiel, and that of the apocalyptic tree of Daniel in chapter 4. It's a great description, great little piece of the vision. In Daniel, the crown of the tree reaches to heaven and its branches cover the earth. Under it dwell the beasts of the field, and in its branches nest the birds of the sky. It is magnificent, right? These well-known figures undoubtedly influenced the transmission, right, and reshaping of the original parable. I think this just very nicely describes how that transmission happens, and very honestly these changes take place. In his use of this metaphor, Jesus is understating the image for comic effect. Have you ever read the mustard seed parable as humorous? That was an honest, not a rhetorical question. I don't think I ever had. I don't think I ever stopped to think that it's actually meant to make me chuckle. What do you all think?
I never have.
Yeah. The mighty cedar is now an ordinary garden weed. Right? This is parody. For Jesus, God's domain was a modest affair, not a new world empire. This was pervasive but unrecognized, rather than noisy and arresting. Some scholars have proposed an alternative interpretation. The birds stand for those irritating toll collectors and sinners, aka the followers of Jesus, who are attracted to a noxious plant, God's domain, and God's empire thus sprouts up in Israel's ordered field as an unwanted intrusion. On either reading, the parable betrays an underlying sense of humor on Jesus's part. It is also antisocial in that it endorses counter movements and ridicules established tradition.
I just like to say that in recent years I've come to think of that Jesus must have been really humorous, and that's part of why the crowd was so attracted to him.
Yep.
He was major entertainment.
He was It wasn't just a guy. Yep. I hear you. I mean, I think there's something to that, right? That's really kind of a fun thing to consider, isn't it? I think I will read the rest of this. Just the fellows judged the version in Thomas to be the closest to the original. It was therefore given a red designation. The three synoptic versions have been accommodated to a greater or lesser degree to the apocalyptic tree theme, and so were designated pink. This parable is a good example of how the original Jesus tradition, perhaps shocking in its modesty or poorly understood, is revised to accommodate living and powerful mythical images drawn from Hebrew scriptures. So that sheds a little bit more light, I think, hopefully on the complexity actually of their color scheme and how they're thinking about all these sayings. So let's move on, shall we? There's a version of this saying, grapes are not harvested from thorn trees, nor are figs gathered from thistles. So there are various kind of variations on this. So, and all of them are coded pink in the 5 Gospels because we're not sure what he actually said. Probably said something like this kind of thing. The Father's imperial rule is like a merchant who had a supply of merchandise and then found a pearl. That merchant was prudent. He sold the merchandise and bought the single pearl for himself. And then I included the next part. So also with you, seek this treasure that is unfailing, that is enduring, with where no moth comes to eat, no worm destroys. I included the gray, right, which is, he probably didn't say that part, is what's suggesting. It sounds like something he might have said, but I don't think he actually said this. Because it's a story that you do hear at random, you know, a pearl of great price, you know, the pearl, right, the pearl in the field that he sells everything. It's really an interesting and kind of confounding story, right, or parable. This one's a little bit more drastic, a little bit more direct. Prudent, that's not a word that, you know, anyway. So, but what I found over and over again is the Jesus Seminar, the fellows voted much higher on the voting hierarchy for the things that are said versus these kind of the conclusion or the wrap it up and drive it home parts, you know, like we've got a parable here, and then how it is then interpreted, or kind of the piece that's meant to be taken away from it is usually a lower on the scale than the saying itself, which is, again, I just find it interesting. You know, maybe he really didn't try to make sure people understood what he was saying, which is one of the things that comes up for people, especially in the Gospel of Mark, that he seems to enjoy the fact that some people don't understand what he's saying, which is kind of a jerk way to be. So I don't want that to be Jesus. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, there's some scholars who are like that, and they're just not my favorite, you know? All right. Drawing from Mark then, and then I did the rest of what's in Mark that was pink or red, and then because it's earlier than Matthew and Luke, so there's a lot in Mark. Not that there are more in the collection, it's just that I drew from Mark first. So there are lots of parallels in Matthew and Luke from Mark. Does that make sense? Since when do the able-bodied need a doctor? It's the sick who do, right? The groom's friends can't fast while the groom is present, can they? So long as the groom is around, you can't expect them to fast. And what came after that was not pink, it was gray or black, right? And nobody pours young wine into old wineskins. So something about the wine and wineskins shows up in, I think, all 5, maybe just 4 of the 5. And so it is pink, but it's similar in all 5, you know, similar, but it's not red, but it is very popular, right? Their rendering, these are all the scholars' version renderings of these passages. In case you're wondering, the Sabbath day was created for Adam and Eve, not Adam and Eve for the Sabbath day. So the son of Adam lords it even over the Sabbath day. No one can enter a powerful man's house to steal his belongings unless he first ties him up. Only then does he loot his house. And here's a different seed parable, right? One that you're familiar with, the sowing along different parts of the path, right? So listen to this. The sower went out to, oh, sorry, that's a typo. Went out to sow. While he was sowing, some seed fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Other seed fell on rocky ground where there wasn't much soil, and it came up right away because the soil had no depth. But when the sun came up, it was scorched, and because it had no root, it withered. Still other seed fell among thorns, and the thorns came up and choked it so that it produced no fruit. Finally, some good seed fell on good earth and started producing fruit. The seed sprouted and grew. One part had a yield of 30, another part 60, and a third part 100. And that conclusion driving it home part is in gray.
What's interesting to me about this selection is it has what I'll call an eternal feel. Like, okay, we're planting seeds for what? For this life or for the next life? So that's a question. And then there was another question that I had about the Jesus seminar. One of the assumptions is that Jesus was a itinerant, and I don't know if this is the right way to say it, but cynic philosopher. And this is the first time I've ever heard about that type of philosophy, so okay. I wasn't aware of it. So how does that play into this? Is this part of his cynic philosopher, or is this something else?
Great question, first of all. Oops, sorry, that was unintentional. I don't, right off the top of my head, I'm trying to draw up all the characteristics of the cynics, the itinerants, yes, cynics, and the word kuon is the word for dog. They're named after the dogs who lived outside on the porch, and that's my association with cynics. Anyway, so my answer right now on the spot is not going to be terribly impressive. I'm stuck at your first question or your first observation, which is you have been led to potentially read eternal thinking into that, right? What if you hadn't, right? What if you didn't already have that mental framework about eternity and eternal life, and that we're actually, what are we, talking to agrarian people about planting and harvesting. And that might sound pretty lush, might sound rather productive, and might be encouraging in a this life kind of way, potentially, right? I feel like I want to get back to you on the cynic part. I don't want to brush it off, but I also don't have a whole lot to say right now about that. I do think that they aren't necessarily all thinking that he was a cynic philosopher. I think the piece, at least that's relevant, is that one can see that kind of thought potentially influencing some of what we see in the sayings, and that it may be that is part of what helps them to rate some things higher than others, right, or to rate something higher. And I'm thinking of a hierarchy in terms of the colors. Sorry that I don't have a better response to the cynic part, but
that's okay.
Yeah.
I think we could all look. I mean, I don't mean to put you on the spot.
No, it's fine.
It's certainly realistic that you wouldn't know.
Well, I might know a little bit more about it next time we meet.
I'll try to.
Yeah. But I like that I like the question, and I like the way you're kind of applying what you've been looking into to this whole process. So yeah, I appreciate that. This is a familiar one, right? I think we're all familiar with this one. Sorry. Since when is the lamp brought in to be put under the bushel basket or under the bed? No, it's put on the lampstand, isn't it? I really like their translation. But yes, this is pink, and yes, this shows up in at least 3 of the 5. I believe this shows up in Thomas. In fact, to those who have more will be given, and from those who don't have, even what they do have will be taken away. One of the things I'm really struck by in going through all of this is they are leaning much more heavily towards the saying, the aphorism, the proverb, the pithy saying as potentially something he really did say, and the added framework around it that it helps explain it or applies it to certain situations. Really, the way they're talking about it, yeah, that's gray or black. And the reason I raise it now on this particular saying is this saying is a part of one of my, I really like the Gospel of Luke. So this is me my bias is, I'm very clear on what my bias is when it comes to Jesus. I'm a big fan of the social gospel Jesus, and I'm the social justice guy, right? But this comes from one of the parables that I think, in context of the Gospel of Luke, it comes at the, as he's in Jerusalem and he's telling this story about the way business managers run things. And it's a story that I certainly for a time in my life tried to apply to God and Jesus and the followers of Christ. But I think it's a critique of shady business dealings and of people, not of people making money in unjust ways. And then people who are really good at that end up getting more and end up and so what I'm trying to get at here is this saying, I think, is a critique. The one we just looked at isn't a critique, it's something else. It's an interesting point, and it would have been said in a very different context. perhaps trying to encourage his disciples to live into all of their gifting, right? You know, like don't hide what you got, right? That's a very different thing than this frustration and calling out of, you know, of unjust or unethical business dealings. It's very interesting because when we're trying to get to that, this effort very much, you know, I don't know, it just raises all kinds of questions for me in terms of, you know, what others have said, in terms of misunderstanding what he was saying. You know, you've got a family member who has all kinds of one-liners or has all kinds of great stories that they pull out in the right occasion, and you got to know the right occasion in which to pull the story into, right? I mean, I don't know. It's been really interesting for me to kind of think through this process a little bit differently than I have in the past. So anyway, they keep saying God's imperial rule instead of the kingdom of God. And another seed, this one is included. So this is similar. So I think part of why, another thing that came up for me is on the Westar website, they say there are 11 aphorisms or sayings and 11 parables that are red or pink. So that's 22 stories. But the problem is when you go through the 5 Gospels, there's a lot more than 22 stories or sayings that are pink, even when you account for the overlap. So I was like, what's going on? Wait, this was way more confusing than I wanted it to be. I just wanted to slap all of the things that are pink or red on a slideshow for you all. It doesn't work that way. So the basic story of sower and seed is something pink, something they're pretty sure he said, but there's several different versions so that they're grouping under that, right? Or something might be shaded pink here in their 5 Gospels, but it was almost split between pink and gray, for instance. So that probably didn't make their ultimate list of 11, but it's listed here because I didn't go through and read all of the footnotes in terms of which ones were, you know, almost gray. Anyway, so, you know, as with so many things in life, the more we want to read or understand something, you know, and we look into it further and further, it's really nice to have a list of 11 sayings and 11 parables, but it's not that simple, even with this. So I think that's also kind of reassuring or something. I don't know. This whole process is complicated and much more organic. So no prophet goes without respect, except on his home turf and among his relatives and at home. That shows up in all 5. These short sayings, right? What's the image we're getting of Jesus according to these? Listen to me, all of you, and try to understand. It's not what goes into a person that from the outside that can defile it. Rather, it's what comes out of the person that defiles, and the drive it home line. Certainly added later. Salt is good. If salt becomes bland, with what will you renew it? That shows up in several, right? Well, the children come up to me. Don't try to stop them. After all, God's domain is people with such as these. I feel like there might be a typo there. I'm sorry about that, but you get the basic idea. Pay the emperor what belongs to the emperor, and God what belongs to God. This is something they believe he absolutely, most likely, definitely, probably said. And I was just sad by this one because the parallel of this in Luke is a very strong story for me. I really like this one, you know? So I had to very sadly type this in. Look out for the scholars who like to parade around in long robes, insist on being addressed properly in the marketplaces, and prefer important seats in the synagogues and the best couches at banquets. They are the ones who prey on widows and their families and recite long prayers just to put on airs. These people will get a stiff sentence. That's it. So now we're moving into just a handful more in Matthew and Luke, and that's what we get. That's the boiled down, most likely stuff. And so their version here, instead of blessed are, right, is a little bit more direct, a little bit more everyday language. Congratulations to the poor in spirit. Heaven's domain belongs to them. Congratulations to those who grieve. They will be consoled. Congratulations to those who hunger and thirst for justice. They will have a feast. You should come to terms quickly with your opponent while you're both on the way to court. Or else your opponent will hand you over to the judge, and the judge will turn you over to the bailiff, and you are thrown in jail. I swear to you, you'll never get out of there until you pay the last dime. I bet some of you knew that this was red, didn't you? Don't turn the other cheek. Don't react violently against the one who's evil. When someone slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other as well. When someone wants to sue you for your shirt, let that person have your coat along with it. Further, when anyone conscripts you for 1 mile, go an extra mile. Give to the one who begs from you. Don't turn away the one who tries to borrow from you. The variation on this about not loaning an interest, but give to those from whom you do not expect to have it back. So that is in pink because it's similar to this, but it's not quite the same. Love your enemies. I just found this one interesting in that it is such a compilation of, right? We have a concept about loving your enemies. They wanted to tie together with this one, the pink, maybe. And then you tied it together with this phrase in between. God causes the sun to rise on both the bad and the good and sends rain on both the just and the unjust. Tell me, if you love those who love you, why should you be commended for that? Even the toll collectors do as much, don't they? No big deal. When you give to charity, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. And this came up the first week. Interesting though, right? The focus is on money here, right? That the higher up in the saying, right? The higher up in the ranking here. Our Father. So fairly strong affirmation that they, in that Jesus would have called God Father, right? That's how I read this, right? That is something he would have said. And then your name be revered, impose your imperial rule. Maybe not quite that, but certainly something like it, right? Provide us with the bread we need, forgive our debts. Interesting when you boil it down to what they think is pink or red, right? No one can be a slave to two masters, no doubt. That slave will either hate one and love the other, or be devoted to one and disdain the other. You can't be enslaved to both God and a bank account. Some things speak over time, do they not? That's why I tell you, don't fret about life, what you're going to eat or drink, or about your body, what you're going to wear. There's more to living than food and clothing, isn't there? Take a look at the birds of the sky, the rest of it, so forth and so on. Why do you notice the sliver in your friend's eye, but overlook the timber in your own? I like that translation. How can you say to your friend, let me get the sliver out of your eye, when there's a timber in your own, you phony? First, take the timber out of your own eye, and then you'll see well enough to remove the sliver from your friend's eye. Kind of the backside of, you can't help someone else if you're not in a good space yourself. First rule of life saving, you always stay in a safe space. You have to take care of yourself. Deal with your own crap first before you try to help other people deal with their crap. Ask and it will be given. Seek, you'll find. Knock, it'll be opened. Rest assured. Everyone who asks receives. Everyone who seeks finds. For the one who knocks, it is opened. Given the other things that we're looking at, it's an interesting, kind of back to Jason's question, in what context would he have meant that? Follow me and leave it to the dead to bury their own dead. I just don't even know what to do with that saying. It just cracks me up. You must be as sly as a snake and as simple as a dove. This is quite it's quite a bar, really. It's clever and kind, innocent, right? After all, there's nothing veiled that won't be unveiled or hid that won't be made known. We are almost at the end here. What do sparrows cost? A penny apiece? Yet not one of them will fall to the earth without the consent of your Father. As for you, even the hairs on your head have all been counted. So don't be timid. You're worth, sorry for the typo, more than a flock of sparrows. It's similar to the worry not about what you will eat and wear. What did you go out to the wilderness to gawk at? A reed shaking in the wind? What did you really go out to see? A man dressed in fancy clothes? Wait a minute. Those who wear fancy clothes are found in regal quarters. What's your motive here, people? Heaven's imperial rule is like leaven, which a woman took and concealed in 50 pounds of flour until it was all leavened. So we're focusing really on, right, the imperial rule and lots of money issues, right? There was a man, the whole story that we refer to as the Good Samaritan is considered red. He said this one. But the questions afterward, who is your neighbor? Which man in the story is your neighbor? Those questions they deemed black. So the story itself, yes. There was this rich man whose manager had been accused of squandering his master's property. He called him in and said, "What's this I hear about you? Let's have an audit of your management because your job's about to be terminated and I need to know what's going on." And that whole parable is in red, but not what comes after it. Not the, so you should interact with people in the world, whatever the kind of wrap up is. That's in gray. And there we have it. There's nothing in John that is new to the list. So I'm curious what you all are thinking. Where does this leave you? Who is this guy that the Jesus Seminar fellows have outlined for us?
I think at first glance, right, it's confusing. And I'm really trying to understand their perspective before I can say, oh, I understand it. I mean, that's so circular, but okay. So are they proposing a new cosmology? Like what's going on here?
Okay. Yeah, that's honest. And that's kind of part of what I'm looking for here, right? This should be a little bit disconcerting to really sit with this, right? What about others of you? What do you make of this?
I have a hard time thinking of it outside of the historical context.
Can you say more about what you're thinking there, Martha?
To me, it immediately, I want to know what did the audience hear and why did it resonate with the audience?
Yes. And you mean on each of those sayings, or is that what you mean?
Right. Right. And then the next piece would be, and why did the authors put them together the way they did? Yeah. I mean, that's sort of where it leads me.
Good. Thank you. Yeah.
Where it leaves me is I really like this fits my picture of Jesus.
Oh, it does. It does. That's interesting, Maren.
Yeah.
Ow.
He doesn't have any doubts about what he says in those things. That's what he really believes.
Okay.
He knows from his heart, from his prayers, whatever.
Okay.
He doesn't really try to convince other people. They have to come themselves to what he believes.
There's no sweet talk.
Yeah, right. It's not his job to convince people.
Agreed.
It's his job to say what he has been told the message is. That's my own personal belief about it.
Sure.
I think that so many of what you've listed as the sayings of Jesus, it's what people want to believe, and it's what history wants to believe about Jesus.
The list that we just read through?
Yeah.
I'm not sure that I agree with that. I mean, I love you, Harriet. I'm not sure that I agree with that. Because I think
you said that these are sayings of Jesus?
Yeah, I mean, what I mean is none of all the good stuff from John is in there, you know?
Right.
Church needs all the good stuff in John, doesn't it?
No, and that's my favorite gospel.
I know.
But maybe the point is that these were preserved.
Say more.
If they weren't important to somebody somewhere, they wouldn't have stuck around.
Mm-hmm.
what you said earlier when we first began about if he really was the Son of God, all the miracles.
If he really was God in human flesh, which is not the same thing as saying Son of God.
Right.
Okay.
Something I've always had trouble with appeared partway through your presentation about the person who touched the edge of his cloak, or and when it is explained that he turns around and says, "Who touched me?" If he was the Son of God, he would already have known that. He would have known who that was, wouldn't you think? Yeah.
So if he was omniscient, then he clearly would have known that, right?
Right. Why would he need to have asked that question? And that's always troubled me. So that's why this is helpful.
Oh, good.
That the little bit of doubt intellectually that I have is not supported by consistency throughout the stories.
So this is actually a helpful way for you to not be troubled by what you're observing. Just observing. Like it's not like you're trying to raise a question. You just can't. Excellent. That makes Marcus, wherever he is, very happy, right? Thoughts about the bareness, perhaps, or the tone that we get from that list that we looked through? We'll go backwards. Let's see. I'll just kind of, the manager, Good Samaritan, 11.
So I think it presents some interpretation. There's some thought that the parables, aren't to be taken literally, that understanding the culture at which the parable was written and that point in time, there's more meaning behind the parable. So there's a literal interpretation that may have been for the people, but then there's something underneath it. And parables to me have always been multi-layered in that way. And the way that the Jesus Seminar approaches this, it's not always clear, like if they're trying to elaborate more on interpretation, or are they just taking a vote as to what was said? I don't know if I'm making sense, but
I think so. I think I'm tracking with your comment. I think they're doing a really nice straddle there in terms of, you said, were they trying to interpret, or were they just voting? And the thing is, I think that there's an important amount of well-researched, grounded understanding of first century context, of literary, not just literary, how various genres function, but also, again, in the context. There is a lot. There's a decent amount of building on a presupposition, an understanding that they are already working with of who Jesus was. And again, I'm struck by, I'm having this kind of this knee-jerk reaction in me, responding to your observations and your questions, Jason, of what is so interesting to me. Hang with me here, because it's going to seem like I'm going off on a tangent, but I promise it's all related. Is that the early church very quickly took to this element of taking Jesus's parables or story or comparative stories and finding lots of ways to read it. In fact, we have tractates from 2nd, 3rd century where men would explain there are 4 different ways to read any given parable. And here's the thing, they're all spiritual interpretations. And what I have a very strong conviction about, which is only because it's the way I can connect to Jesus. So Who knows if it's actually the real deal? But my way of reading Jesus is through a lens that does critique, that is out for economic and political justice. And what that means to me is that there are times when I feel very comfortable saying a literal reading of this story, as in this story is about a landowner who actually plants a vineyard and treats his employees this way, and then throws them out and starts over. That story needs to be read literally, because Jesus, my Jesus, is telling this story to point out the behavior of the men in the temple. And I have a framework that I work with, right, that makes sense to me. And when someone tells me that the way they've been taught that story is on a very spiritual level, which the church has done, I'm thinking of a very particular parable here, the church has spiritualized most, if not all, of the parables and the sayings that are about economics and are critiquing unjust and unfair economic dealings and political dynamics. So that most people are taught to think of them in terms of their layers of meaning and application. But I suspect that that is primarily a function of the church not wanting to be critiqued about, not wanting to get their hands dirty, get in the deep, get in there with those who do work barely managing to survive jobs, and those who are being exploited by the taxation system, and that people in the church don't want to deal with that. Or in fact, their lived reality doesn't even allow them to see that that's what the story was about originally. And the only way they can make sense of the story is if they turn it into all these metaphors. So I don't know if my points here, if it's clear how I'm trying to connect all of these points, but there's an element to what I see happening in the Jesus seminar that is about trying to invite people to consider pulling back, not throwing away, but simply pulling back the layers of Christology, the things that have been said about this guy, about his execution and his resurrection, and everything that's done with that afterwards. There's all kinds of doctrine and theology that does happen, right? And that the church has inherited and passes along. But in getting back to this guy and being honest about who this guy was and the things he would have said and done, it does, I'm forgetting the name of the woman who said it. It makes it easier for Holly. Makes it easier for you to consider this guy, to see what's going on. But from my perspective, it also helps us to see an example that does speak quite loudly to us today. And it's not easy. And it's not just about taking care of your soul in the afterlife. It's about addressing life here and now, and that to me is not just relevant, but that is worth laying down your life for, right? I mean, so I don't know if my threads are all connecting for you all, but they made a little tapestry for me. I just don't know if I've communicated well for you.
Thanks.
Does that make any sense at all? Or is there something in there? Okay.
I mean, I think it's the journey, right? Like,
yeah, sure.
At least it elaborates on that point that I was trying to ask, and I appreciate
okay.
that.
Yeah, thank you. You're trying. I appreciate that. I think ultimately what this process in general does is it should be uncomfortable, because it's asking us to differentiate between the person and the faith, the system of belief and faith that's built up around him. And that's very uncomfortable initially. That was very uncomfortable for me. I was the person who mocked this Jesus of history versus Christ of faith. What? You want to separate the two? You can't separate the two. Oh, but yes, you can. And it makes the two, you know, much more interesting on their own. Again, makes the person much more remarkable, and so forth. This guy was a bit salty. Right?
For me, one thing looking at these, the pink and red is, it's not about gentle Jesus, meek and mild.
Thank you. That was nicely said, Keith. Yeah.
It's much more complicated. And I think one of the ways that I think about what the Jesus Seminar was trying to do was, a way of thinking about what you've said, Jennifer, is certainly after the church became part of the empire, and even before, they were working to domesticate Jesus. And what I think one of the goals of the Jesus Seminar was to try to say, okay, can we get to a place where we can think about what Jesus, what it might have been like, particularly in his historical context, before all of this domestication took place.
Yeah.
And that is a challenge because we've all been reared in, you know, almost 2 millennia of the post-domestication, after the domestication started.
Right. And you say, raised in or reared in, and even if we come to it later in life or whatever, right? That
right.
We're still inheriting. The thing
right.
we're
yes.
being immersed in has well steeped.
Right. Yeah, and I think I heard a talk recently by an African-American theologian who made the observation that white Jesus is, as you have said, really all about individual salvation. Mm-hmm. And Black Jesus is all about the community.
Yep.
And in many ways, it seems that the pink and red Jesus is much more about the community than about this notion of individual salvation.
That's right.
So it's interesting to be having these conversations at a time when we white people are being confronted with our privilege in new ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Nice. Oh, that's lovely the way you tied that together. Thank you. Yeah. Black Jesus changes everything, right? The way you define sin, the way you, all of it. I feel like that's a good one to go out on, unless there are other comments or questions or.
Yeah, I'd like to suggest that the Jesus Seminar is a continuation. I think the early church, in developing the creed, stayed and then later give us the canonical Gospels, because the creed predates the selection of the canonization process. And they throw out much of the apocryphal Gospels. And I don't know if people there are aware of them or not, but some of them are thrown out because they're even wilder and weirder than the so-called miracle stories that we have. And there's also the suggestion that some of the dialogue that we find engaged in the Gospels is really kind of a midrash on Christian thought, where you take something that happened and invent the dialogue that goes with it. And of course, this is the way in which Herodotus puts together his history of things that happened a couple hundred years before he even lived.
Right.
And so we have, I come out of a background, like I grew up in the Methodist Church and became known as a biblical bigot, and grew out of that to see the possibility of how other things influence even the stories that we have from Jesus. So I'm just saying maybe what we're saying in the Jesus Seminar is a continuation of this whole process.
Yes. I think, yes, it is a continuation of the process to understand who this guy was and how are we going to have productive, meaningful conversations. I do want to just clarify one thing. We have decisions about you mentioned the canonization. The canon was defined the end of the 4th century for sure. And the creeds were being written at the beginning of the 4th century. But we have collections of just the 4 gospels, the 4 canonical gospels, as early as the year 200. So I wanted to throw that in there, not to correct, but to complexify what you'd said, in that there was already a leaning toward these ideas are correct. These stories of this guy's life are correct. But you were right. Like, yeah, a lot of other ideas were thrown out. As I agree with you, I'm not as big a fan of, because I didn't grow up on them, making sense of them in my own way. Yeah, I mean, the Jesus Seminar fellows stand on the shoulders of 150 years or more, actually. When did Reimarus begin? Was it late 18th century? I have to go look at the dates again. So there have been waves of academic approaches to these over the centuries. I want to leave with what you've thrown out there, and I do think it's complicated, right? I mean, in a very kind of honest, I see the implications of what they're doing very similar to what I see, for instance, Bishop Spong doing, which is to say, I'm trying to invite our critical thinking into this conversation. I don't want to do away with the community, and I don't want to do away with the tradition entirely, but I want us to be honest and more current. I want us to bring our current understandings of the world into our faith tradition, into our faith, the space of our faith in our community. And right, it's 2,000 years. That is a slow ship to turn or transform, or whatever you want to say, right? And I take heart in the efforts. I personally am quite heartened by, what these primarily men, but what they've been saying and doing and what it's led to. Yeah. Thank you, Monty, for your observation. I appreciate that. I think I'll be moving on to talking about, since the seminar has wrapped up, what are some of there are a lot out there. So I'll pick and choose and try to present some trajectories and present some ideas for the next 3 classes. So I'm wishing you all a happy and safe Christmas and New Year's, and I'll see you in Epiphany.